The numbers coming out of Florida tell us something far more significant than just one poll or one moment in time. What we're seeing is a structural shift in how voters are beginning to process the distance between campaign promises and governing reality. When a politician who built an entire brand on unwavering loyalty and unshakable support in key strongholds suddenly faces erosion in those very places, we have to ask ourselves, what changed? This isn't about personalities or theatrics. This is about material conditions. People are watching their costs rise, their economic security diminish, and their faith in institutions, including political figures they once trusted, beginning to crack under the weight of unmet expectations. Florida has long been considered solid ground, a place where certain political calculations were taken for granted. But polls are now showing something different, something that reflects a deeper disillusionment. Voters are not simply reacting to rhetoric anymore. They're evaluating outcomes. They're asking whether the promises made translate into tangible improvements in their daily lives. And when those improvements don't materialize, when the economic pressures continue to mount, political loyalty becomes negotiable. This is the dialectic of politics meeting economics, and it's unfolding right now in real time. Let's understand what's actually happening here, because the surface narrative that's being pushed through mainstream media channels is missing the deeper systemic forces at play. When we talk about polling data from Florida showing unexpected vulnerability for Trump, we're not just talking about approval ratings or hypothetical matchups. We're talking about the material reality of millions of people whose economic circumstances have been shaped by decades of policy decisions that favored capital over labor, that prioritized corporate profits over worker security, and that systematically dismantled the social safety nets that once provided some measure of stability for working families. This is the context that matters, and it's the context that rarely gets the attention it deserves in our political discourse. Florida has been transformed over the past several decades into a laboratory for a particular kind of economic model. You have massive wealth concentrated in certain coastal areas. You have retirement communities filled with people living on fixed incomes who are watching their purchasing power erode month after month, and you have working-class communities across the state where people are holding down 2 or 3 jobs just to keep their heads above water. This is not a sustainable model, and the political consequences of this unsustainability are now beginning to manifest in ways that are making political strategists extremely nervous. The poll numbers we're seeing are not anomalies. They're symptoms of a much larger crisis in the relationship between political leadership and economic reality. Think about what Trump represented to many voters in Florida and across the country. He positioned himself as the outsider, the businessman who would shake up Washington, who would drain the swamp, who would put America first, and bring back manufacturing jobs, and restore economic security to communities that had been devastated by globalization and deindustrialization. That narrative was powerful because it spoke to real grievances, real pain, real experiences of economic decline that millions of people had lived through. But here's the critical question that we have to examine. Did the policies that were actually implemented during the Trump administration address the structural causes of that economic insecurity? Or did they simply redistribute wealth upward while providing rhetorical satisfaction to voters who were desperate for someone to acknowledge their struggles? The 2017 tax cuts are a perfect example of this disconnect. We were told that cutting corporate tax rates would lead to investment, job creation, wage growth, and a reinvigoration of the American economy. What actually happened? Corporations used the vast majority of that tax windfall for stock buybacks, which enriched shareholders and executives, but did virtually nothing for ordinary workers. The promised wage increases never materialized at the scale that was predicted. The manufacturing renaissance that was supposed to follow never arrived. Infrastructure remained crumbling. Healthcare costs continued to rise. Housing became increasingly unaffordable. Student debt continued to crush young people. All the fundamental economic pressures that were driving voter anxiety in the first place remained in place, and in many cases intensified. Now we're in a different phase of the economic cycle, and the consequences of those policy choices are becoming impossible to ignore. Inflation has eaten away at whatever modest wage gains working people might have experienced. The cost of basic necessities, food, housing, healthcare, energy, has risen dramatically. People are feeling the squeeze in their daily lives, in every transaction, in every bill that comes due. And when people are under that kind of economic pressure, their tolerance for political rhetoric without substantive results diminishes rapidly. They start asking harder questions. They start looking more critically at what was promised versus what was delivered. This is what's showing up in the polling data from Florida. But let's go deeper into the Florida-specific dynamics, because they're instructive for understanding the broader national picture. Florida has no state income tax, which sounds appealing on the surface, but it means that the state relies heavily on sales taxes, property taxes, and other forms of revenue that disproportionately impact working-class and middle-class families. The burden of funding public services falls more heavily on those who can least afford it. Meanwhile, property insurance costs in Florida have skyrocketed, driven by climate-related risks that insurance companies are increasingly unwilling to absorb. Homeowners are seeing their insurance premiums double or triple, and in some cases, they can't get coverage at all. This is a direct hit to household budgets, and it's not something that political rhetoric can paper over. The healthcare situation in Florida is another pressure point. The state did not expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, leaving hundreds of thousands of low-income Floridians without access to affordable health care. Hospitals are struggling, rural health care facilities are closing, and people are making impossible choices between paying for medical care and paying for other necessities. When you're in that situation, when you're watching your economic security deteriorate despite working harder than ever, the political promises about making America great again start to ring hollow. You want concrete solutions to concrete problems, and if those solutions aren't forthcoming, your political loyalty becomes conditional. The immigration issue in Florida is also more complex than the simplified narratives we usually hear. Florida has large immigrant communities, particularly from Latin America and the Caribbean, and many of these communities have historically leaned conservative on certain issues. But when the political rhetoric around immigration becomes increasingly harsh, when families are worried about deportation, when communities are being scapegoated for economic problems they didn't create, that creates its own set of political pressures. People are paying attention to the tone, the substance, and the real-world impact of immigration policies. They're not just voting on abstract principles. They're voting based on how policies affect their families, their neighbors, their communities. Education is another fault line that's showing up in Florida's political landscape. The state has been at the center of intense cultural battles over curriculum, book bans, restrictions on teaching about race and gender, and the defunding of public education in favor of privatization schemes. Parents are watching their children's schools struggle with inadequate funding, teacher shortages, and politicized interference in what should be educational decisions. Teachers are leaving the profession in droves because they're underpaid, overworked, and increasingly disrespected. This creates a crisis in educational quality that affects families directly, and it's not the kind of issue that gets resolved through political theater. It requires investment, resources, and a commitment to public education as a public good, not as a market to be exploited. The environmental realities in Florida are becoming impossible to ignore. Sea level rise is not a future hypothetical. It's a present reality affecting coastal communities. Flooding is more frequent and more severe. Hurricane intensity is increasing. Property values in vulnerable areas are beginning to reflect these risks. Insurance companies are pulling out of the market or raising rates to levels that many homeowners simply cannot afford. The ecological degradation of Florida's waterways, the toxic algae blooms, the dying coral reefs, these are all manifestations of environmental policies that prioritized short-term economic interests over long-term sustainability. And voters, particularly younger voters who are thinking about their futures, are connecting these dots. They're understanding that climate denial is not a viable political position when you're literally watching your state become less habitable. What we're witnessing in this polling data is the collision between political mythology and lived experience. The mythology says that certain policies lead to prosperity, that certain approaches to governance produce results, that certain political figures can deliver on their promises through force of will alone. The lived experience tells a different story. It tells a story of stagnant wages, rising costs, deteriorating public services, environmental degradation, and a political system that seems increasingly responsive to the interests of the wealthy and powerful rather than to the needs of ordinary people. When that gap between mythology and experience becomes too wide, political realignments become possible. This is not unique to Trump or to Florida, or even to this particular moment in American politics. This is a pattern we've seen throughout history. When economic systems fail to deliver broadly shared prosperity, when the distance between the rhetoric of political leaders and the reality of people's lives becomes too great, political stability breaks down. Voters who once seemed reliably aligned with a particular party or candidate begin to question those allegiances. They start looking for alternatives, even if those alternatives are imperfect or uncertain. The status quo becomes untenable when the status quo is producing declining living standards and increasing insecurity. The Republican Party in Florida has dominated state politics for years, building a governing coalition based on promises of low taxes, limited government, business-friendly policies, and cultural conservatism. But that coalition is held together by the assumption that these policies produce positive outcomes for the people who vote for them. When that assumption is challenged by material reality, when people's lives are not actually improving, when their economic security is not actually increasing, when their communities are not actually thriving, the coalition becomes vulnerable. This is what political strategists mean when they talk about the erosion of a base. It's not that voters suddenly change their ideological beliefs overnight. It's that they reassess whether the party or the candidate they've been supporting is actually serving their interests. The national implications of what's happening in Florida extend far beyond one state's electoral votes. Florida has been seen as a bellwether, a state that reflects broader trends in American politics. If Trump is showing unexpected vulnerability in a state that he won comfortably in previous elections, that suggests that the political landscape is shifting in ways that could affect races across the country. It suggests that the coalition that brought Trump to power in the first place is fracturing under the weight of unmet expectations and deteriorating economic conditions. This is not a minor development. This is a potentially transformative moment in American politics. But here's where we need to be careful about drawing conclusions. The fact that Trump may be losing support in Florida does not automatically mean that voters are moving toward a progressive alternative or embracing a fundamentally different economic vision. It could simply mean that they're looking for a different version of the same basic approach, a different messenger delivering similar policies with different branding. Political change without economic transformation is just rearranging the deck chairs. Unless we address the underlying structural issues, the concentration of wealth and power, the exploitation of labor, the degradation of the environment, the privatization of public goods, the erosion of democratic accountability, we'll just cycle through different political figures without actually solving the problems that are driving voter dissatisfaction. This is why it's so important to connect the political analysis to the economic analysis. Politics is not separate from economics. Political outcomes are shaped by economic structures, and economic structures are maintained or transformed through political decisions. When we see polling data showing political vulnerability, we need to ask what economic conditions are producing that vulnerability. When we see voter dissatisfaction, we need to understand what material grievances are driving that dissatisfaction. And when we think about political alternatives, we need to evaluate whether those alternatives actually address the root causes of the problems people are experiencing or whether they're just offering new packaging for old policies. The challenge for anyone who wants to build a genuinely transformative political movement is to connect with voters on the basis of their real material interests while also offering a vision of a different kind of economic system, one that prioritizes human needs over corporate profits, one that values sustainability over short-term extraction, one that distributes wealth and power more equitably, one that treats healthcare and education and housing as rights rather than commodities. That's a difficult message to communicate in a political environment dominated by money, media spin, and institutional resistance to fundamental change. But it's the only message that actually addresses the crisis we're facing. The polling numbers from Florida are a symptom. They're not the disease. The disease is an economic system that produces inequality, insecurity, and environmental destruction as its normal operating procedure. Until we confront that reality and build political movements capable of transforming that system, we'll continue to see these cycles of political upheaval followed by disappointment, voter anger followed by superficial change, promises of reform followed by the continuation of policies that serve the interests of the few at the expense of the many. That's the pattern we need to break. And breaking it requires both clear-eyed analysis of what's actually happening and bold vision of what's actually possible.